The silence of the archive was a living thing. It had weight and texture, a fine silver dust that settled over everything, muffling the world outside the reinforced plasteel doors. Elian breathed it in, the sterile, recycled air of the citadel, and tasted nothing. It was the taste of order, of safety, of a life lived between the lines. For 22 years, it was the only taste he had ever truly known. He ran a gloved finger along the spine of a data slate, its surface cool and impassive. The archives were his sanctuary and his prison, a place of profound quiet where the ghosts of a forgotten world whispered from corrupted files and faded schematics. Here, surrounded by the dead, he could almost believe he was not a ghost himself. Almost. A subtle tremor began in his hands, a faint vibration that had nothing to do with the distant, rhythmic hum of the Citadel's life support systems. He pressed his palms flat against the cold metal of the shelving unit, trying to still the insurrection brewing in his own blood. The daily suppressant, a chalky tablet swallowed with a precise measure of purified water, was supposed to be a wall. It was supposed to be absolute. But lately, cracks had begun to show. A wave of heat washed over him, coiling low in his gut. It was a sickening, sweet warmth that felt alien in his own body. His breath hitched. He squeezed his eyes shut, focusing on the scent of the room, the ozone tang of the data servers, the faint, dry perfume of ancient paper composites, the sterile non-smell of the atmospheric purifiers. For years, this sterile symphony had been his anchor. The Citadel scrubbed the air of all pheromonal data, rendering its citizens into neat, manageable designations stripped of their most volatile biology. Alphas, betas, omegas. They were clinical terms on a medical file, not a palpable, dangerous reality. Here everyone was beta by default. Everyone was manageable. Elian had built his entire existence on that lie. He was a beta archivist, catalog number 734, a quiet cog in the great silent machine. He was not a secret. He was not a mistake. He was not an omega. But the tremor in his hands was becoming a shudder, and the heat was becoming a fire. With it came a scent, a phantom on the edge of his perception. It was not the dry dust of the archives or the tang of ozone. It was something green and living, the impossible fragrance of crushed petals after a rainstorm. It was the smell of his own biology, a ghost rising from its grave. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through him. He fumbled inside his tunic for the small, lead-lined case he always carried. Inside, a single emergency dose injector lay nestled in grey foam. His fingers, slick with a sudden sweat, struggled with the clasp. The phantom scent grew stronger, weaving itself into the sterile air of the archive. Petals and ozone, softness and electricity. It was terrifying. It was beautiful. It was him. He finally managed to pry the case open. His movements clumsy and desperate. He stared at the injector, the last bastion of his carefully constructed lie. To use it was to admit the wall was crumbling. To not use it, that was unthinkable. It meant discovery. It meant being taken to the Purity Directorate, to the sterile white rooms where they corrected mistakes like him, where they made you forget you were ever anything but a compliant, scentless citizen. He thought of the stories, whispered in the dark corners of the lower sectors, of omegas who were reintegrated. They came back, different, empty. The scent was a living thing now, a soft cloud unfurling around him, clinging to the fibers of his grey uniform. It was a beacon in the sterile silence. A scream. He ripped the cap from the injector, the plastic making a sharp crack in the profound quiet. He pressed the device to his thigh, his thumb hovering over the activator. Just one press. One more day of being a ghost. One more day of safety. But his thumb wouldn't move. A strange, defiant lethargy had taken root in his limbs. For the first time, the scent of himself did not feel like a sickness. It felt like a memory of a language he had forgotten he knew. Who was he beneath the suppressants and the fear? Who was the boy who smelled of rain and flowers? The injector slipped from his trembling fingers, clattering onto the polished floor. The sound was a gunshot in the silence. The scent bloomed, wild and untamed. And in the deepest, most terrified part of him, a sliver of something that felt dangerously like relief took root. He was no longer a ghost. He was a signal, and he knew, with a certainty that froze the blood in his veins, that someone was coming to answer. Kael moved through the pristine corridors of the citadel like a wraith carved from steel and shadow. His black enforcer uniform absorbed the cold, ambient light, making him a void in the stark white geometry of the Purity Directorate's headquarters. Every line of him was discipline, every movement a study in economy. He was the system made flesh, its most perfect and unquestioning instrument. The air in his lungs was clean, measured, and meaningless. He had been trained since childhood to interpret the world through data streams, tactical overlays, and probability metrics. The physical world, with its chaotic, unpredictable sensory inputs, was a liability, especially scent. Scent was the language of the animal, the chaotic tongue of the designations the Citadel had worked so tirelessly to mute. Kael had been conditioned to ignore it, to filter it out as irrelevant noise, yet his senses were unnaturally sharp, a genetic anomaly the Directorate had noted in his file but deemed controllable. He could detect the faint trace of ozone from a malfunctioning light panel 3 corridors away, the subtle shift in temperature that indicated an open ventilation shaft. He processed these things as data, devoid of romance or poetry. They were simply facts. He stood before the central monitoring dais, his grey eyes fixed on the holographic map of Sector Gamma 7. All was green, all was stable. The rhythmic pulse of the Citadel was a lullaby of absolute control. Then, a flicker. A single data point on the map, in the deep archive sector, flashed amber. It wasn't a security breach, not a life sign anomaly. The alert code was one he hadn't seen activated in years. Pheromonal signature unregistered. His posture, already perfect, somehow became straighter. The other enforcers on duty stiffened, their attention drawn to the anomalous flicker. Unregistered pheromones were a myth, a ghost story used to frighten recruits. The atmospheric scrubbers and the universal suppressant regimen were supposed to make such a thing impossible. "Commander," a technician said, his voice tight with disbelief. "Signature is Omega class, high concentration." A stillness fell over the command center. Omega. The word itself was an obscenity in this temple of order. It spoke of heats, of bonds, of a biological chaos that had no place in their placid, predictable world. It was a disease they had long since cured. Kael's jaw tightened. "Triangulate the source. Dispatch a containment unit." "Source localized," the technician reported, his fingers flying across his console. "Archive 734. Deep storage." Kael's gaze narrowed. Archive 734. A dead zone. Nothing but forgotten data and a single, low-clearance beta archivist. "Relay the containment unit," Kael said, his voice a low, cold command that cut through the rising tension. I will handle it myself. He turned, his black coat swirling around him, and strode from the command center without another word. It was a breach of protocol. A high-concentration Omega event required a full hazmat team, medical stasis, immediate processing. But something else was stirring in him, a flicker of something he refused to name. Curiosity? No, that was an indulgence. It was a need for precision. A containment unit was a blunt instrument. They would contaminate the scene, destroy data. He was a scalpel. He would excise the anomaly with minimal disruption. That was the logic he presented to himself. It was clean. It was rational. As he rode the silent maglift down into the Citadel's lower levels, he allowed himself to access the raw data from the archive's atmospheric sensors. The chemical breakdown was complex, unfamiliar, but beneath the cold, analytical strings of code, a description had been appended by the system's heuristic AI, petrichor, floral notes consistent with Rosa centifolia, ozone, rain, roses, electricity. The words were meaningless, poetic nonsense, yet they snagged on something deep in his mind, a splinter of a forgotten dream. He stepped out into the silent corridor leading to the archives. The air here was older, colder, and beneath the sterile hum of the purifiers, he could smell it. It was faint, impossibly so, a single thread of color in a world of gray. But it was there. His conditioning screamed at him to block it, to register it as a chemical anomaly, and nothing more. But his own anomalous biology, the secret sharpness of his senses, betrayed him. The scent bypassed the logic centers of his brain and went straight to the primal core he'd been trained to deny. It wasn't just a smell. It was a presence, a question. It coiled in his lungs, a strange, sweet ache. It was a scent of vulnerability and of some impossible, defiant strength. It was the scent of a storm breaking in a hidden garden, and it pulled at him. A low, unfamiliar growl rumbled in his chest, a vibration he hadn't felt since adolescence. It was the alpha, the beast he kept caged and starved, stirring in its sleep. He clenched his fists, the leather of his gloves creaking in the silence. He was an enforcer. He was an instrument of order. He would contain the source. He would excise the anomaly. He would not, under any circumstances, answer its call. The plasteel doors to Archive 734 hissed open before him. The scent washed over him, stronger now, a wave of impossible fragrance. And for the first time in his life, Commander Kale felt the ice of his discipline begin to crack. The hiss of the door was the sound of a guillotine falling. Elian flinched, scrambling back until his shoulders hit the cold, unyielding metal of a server rack. He looked up, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs, and saw a figure silhouetted in the stark white light of the corridor. A shadow. A void. The figure stepped inside, and the door slid shut behind him, plunging the archive back into its dim, humming twilight. The silhouette resolved into a man, tall and severe, clad in the matte black uniform of a Purity Directorate enforcer. An alpha. Elian knew it instantly, not from a scent. The air was still too thick with his own panicked fragrance, but from the sheer, crushing weight of his presence. It was like a change in atmospheric pressure, a sudden gravity that made the air thick and hard to breathe. The enforcer's face was a mask of cold neutrality, all sharp angles and shadows, but his eyes, a startling pale grey, scanned the room with an unnerving intensity. They swept over the scattered data slates, the overturned stool, the fallen injector, and finally they locked onto Elian. Time seemed to slow. to stretch thin. The hum of the servers became a deafening roar in Elian's ears. He could feel the alpha's gaze on him, dissecting him, cataloguing him. He felt like a specimen under glass, his every flaw, every secret laid bare. He tried to make himself smaller, to shrink into the shadows, but there was nowhere to hide. His own scent was a betrayal, a confession screaming into the quiet room. The alpha took a slow step forward, his boots making no sound on the polished floor. He moved with a liquid grace that was both beautiful and terrifying. He was a predator, and Elian was the startled prey. Kale felt the scent slam into him, a physical force. Up close, it was dizzying, a complex tapestry of fear and something else, something achingly pure. Rain-soaked petals and ozone. The heuristic AI had been right. It was the smell of a wild, impossible thing in the most sterile place in the universe. It defied logic. It defied the citadel. And it was coming from the terrified man huddled against the server racks. He was small, slender, swallowed by his drab grey uniform. His dark hair was a mess, and his wide, frightened eyes were the color of warm honey. He was trembling, a fine, high-frequency tremor that Kyle could almost feel vibrating in the air. This was the source. This was the anomaly. A part of Kyle's mind, the cold, conditioned part, assessed the situation. Subject is an unregistered Omega, unsuppressed, panicked, a flight risk, threat level, minimal. He should have drawn his stun baton. He should have read the standard containment protocol speech. He should have done his job. But he couldn't. He was transfixed by the scent, by the sight of the terrified archivist. The primal part of him, the alpha he had so long denied, was roaring. It didn't see an anomaly to be excised. It saw something precious, something to be protected. The thought was so alien, so deeply seditious, that it momentarily stunned him. He took another step forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his baton out of pure muscle memory. The archivist flinched, a small wounded sound escaping his lips. "You don't belong here," Kyle said. The words came out harsher than he intended, a low rasp. It was what his training dictated he say. An unregistered Omega did not belong in the Citadel, free and unmonitored. It was a statement of fact. But as soon as the words left his mouth, they tasted like a lie. The scent, the boy's very presence, felt right. It felt like a missing note in a song he'd been hearing his whole life. It felt like home. The words struck Elian like a physical blow. You don't belong here. He already knew that. He had known it every day of his life, every time he swallowed a chalky pill, every time he forced himself to breathe the sterile, scentless air and pretend it was enough. Hearing it spoken aloud by this man, this embodiment of the system that would erase him, was a final, brutal confirmation. The last thread of his composure snapped, the strength fled from his limbs, and the world tilted violently. The edges of his vision blurred, turning grey. The heat in his belly, which had been a slow burn, erupted into a full-blown inferno. His first heat. Here. Now. A wave of slick and a dizzying spike of pheromones flooded the room as his body, free from suppressants for the first time in a decade, surrendered to its own nature. A soft, desperate cry tore from his throat as he crumpled, his body giving out. He was falling, and the last thing he saw was the alpha's impassive face, the grey eyes widening in something that looked shockingly like alarm. He braced for the impact of the cold floor, for the pain, for the end. It never came. Instead of cold, hard composite, he was caught. Strong arms wrapped around him, breaking his fall, pulling him against a chest that was as hard and unyielding as armor. The fabric of the enforcer's uniform was coarse against his cheek. The shock of the contact was a lightning strike, arcing through every nerve in his body. For a moment, there was only the dizzying scent of his own panic and the solid, warm presence of the man holding him. Then, through the haze, he smelled it, the alpha's scent. It wasn't the aggressive, territorial musk he'd been taught to fear. It was something clean and cold, like mountain air and winter frost, with an undercurrent of something darker, like scorched metal and deep earth. It didn't seek to dominate. It sought to soothe. It wrapped around his own frantic scent, calming the storm. He felt the alpha's hand, large and surprisingly gentle, cradle the back of his head. He was not an anomaly. He was not a mistake. In that moment, held in the arms of the man who had just condemned him, Elian felt, for the first time in his life, like he belonged exactly where he was. The weight of the Omega in his arms was startling. He was lighter than Kale had expected, a fragile collection of sharp bones and trembling muscle. The heat radiating from his skin was intense, a feverish wave that soaked through the layers of Kyle's uniform. The scent, now that he was holding its source, was overwhelming. It was no longer a whisper in the air. It was a symphony, a deluge. It flooded Kyle's senses, short-circuiting years of mental conditioning. The alpha in him, awake and raging, recognized the scent for what it was: distress, fear, and the unmistakable, intoxicating aroma of an Omega in full, unsuppressed heat. Every instinct screamed at him to claim, to protect, to mark this scent as his own. A low, possessive growl vibrated in his chest, an involuntary response he couldn't choke back. He looked down at the man in his arms. The archivist, the Omega, was unconscious, his face pale and slick with sweat. His dark lashes cast shadows on his cheekbones. He looked impossibly young, impossibly vulnerable. Kale's gloved hand was still cradling the man's head, his thumb stroking the soft hair at his temple. It was an act of tenderness so foreign, so contrary to his programming, that it felt like a betrayal of his very self. What was he doing? He should have let him fall. He should be calling for the containment unit, for medical stasis, for the reintegration team. Instead, he was holding a fugitive Omega in his arms, soothing him with a scent and a touch he wasn't even aware he was capable of. He was breaking a dozen Purity Directorate protocols with every breath he took. He had to move. He couldn't stay here in the archive, a place that was now irrevocably contaminated. He adjusted his hold, lifting the Omega effortlessly into his arms. The man gave a soft, unconscious sigh and nestled his face into the crook of Kyle's neck, his breath hot against Kyle's skin. The contact sent another jolt through Kyle's system, a fire that had nothing to do with duty and everything to do with a primal, territorial urge he didn't know how to fight. He turned, his movements stiff and robotic, and carried the Omega out of the archive. The corridor was empty, its white light clinical and unforgiving. He needed a secure location, somewhere off the main grid, somewhere he could think. The standard processing center in the medical wing was out of the question. They would take the Omega from him, and the thought of that sent a fresh wave of illogical, savage anger through him. There was a small, decommissioned medical bay in his own barracks sector. It was used for enforcer-specific emergencies, shielded and unregistered on the main Citadel network. A ghost room, perfect. He moved through the Citadel's service corridors, a black-clad figure carrying a precious, illicit burden. He kept to the shadows, his internal sensors mapping patrol routes, avoiding camera sightlines. He moved like a fugitive, not an enforcer. The irony was a bitter taste in his mouth. He reached the secure bay without incident. A scan of his palm granted him access. The room inside was as sterile and white as the rest of the Citadel, but it felt different. It was silent, private, safe. He gently laid the Omega down on the narrow diagnostic bed. The man's grey uniform was rumpled, his face still flushed with fever. Kale stood over him, a storm of conflict raging within him. This was not a chemical spill. This was not a data anomaly. This was a person, an Omega whose scent called to him like nothing ever had before. His duty was clear. He had to report this. He had to turn him in. He pulled out his standard-issue comms unit, his thumb hovering over the button that would connect him to the directorate. He stared at the Omega's face. A small, dark cord was visible at the collar of his tunic. Kyle reached out, his fingers tracing the cord until they found a small, flat object tucked beneath the fabric. He carefully drew it out. It was a charm, a simple, hand-carved piece of dark wood, worn smooth with time. It was shaped like a stylized bird, a swift, with its wings swept back. The shape was familiar. It triggered a flicker of something in the deep recesses of his memory, a half-formed image, a ghost of a feeling. A child crying, the sound of rain on a permacrete roof, a woman's voice humming a lullaby. The memory was gone as quickly as it came, leaving behind an inexplicable ache in his chest. He dismissed it, a meaningless fragment of a dream. He looked from the charm back to the comms unit in his other hand. Duty, protocol, order. The words were the pillars of his entire existence, but the image of the Omega crumpling, the feeling of his fragile weight in Kyle's arms, the impossible scent of rain and roses. These things were a new, undeniable reality. He made a decision. It was illogical. It was indefensible. It was an act of treason. He keyed in his official report. Commander Kell, reporting. Anomaly in Archive 734 investigated. Minor chemical spill from a degraded data slate power cell. Situation contained. Archive sealed for decontamination. No further action required. He sent the message. The lie felt heavy and vast. He had just made himself an accomplice. He had just bound his fate to the unconscious Omega lying on the bed. He looked down at the man, a stranger who now held his career, his life, in his feverish hands. He didn't know why he'd done it. He only knew that the thought of handing him over to the white-coated technicians of the Purity Directorate felt like a kind of sacrilege he was not willing to commit. Elian drifted up from a deep, feverish darkness into a world of white. White walls, white ceiling, a thin white sheet covering him. The air was clean, sterile, but different from the archive. It lacked the underlying tang of ozone and old paper. This was a medical kind of sterility, sharp with the ghost of antiseptic. He blinked, his eyes feeling heavy and slow. Memory returned in fractured shards, the crumbling of his control, the bloom of his own forbidden scent, the terrifying, shadowy figure of the enforcer. The fall, being caught. The strange, cold scent of winter and steel. He sat up with a gasp, his whole body aching as if he'd run for miles. He was in a small, private room, more of a cell than a hospital ward. A single diagnostic bed, a blank wall screen, a sealed door. He was wearing a simple, soft grey tunic and trousers, not his own uniform. Someone had changed his clothes. The thought sent a fresh wave of panic through him. Where was he? Who had brought him here? The door hissed open, and the enforcer stepped inside. The Alpha. In the even, shadowless light of the room, he was even more imposing. The matte black of his uniform seemed to drink the light, and his pale grey eyes were like chips of ice. He held a small tray with a bulb of water and a nutrient paste packet. He placed it on the small table beside the bed without a word. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions. Elian's heart hammered against his ribs. This was it. The interrogation. The processing. He wrapped his arms around himself, a futile gesture of self-protection. "Where am I?" Elian finally whispered, his voice hoarse. "A secure medical bay," the Alpha replied. His voice was a low, level baritone, devoid of any discernible emotion. "You collapsed. You didn't report me." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of disbelief. An enforcer of his rank would never cover for an unregistered Omega. It was career suicide. It was treason. "My report cited a chemical spill," the Alpha said, his gaze unwavering. "The archive is sealed for decontamination." Elian stared at him, trying to parse the motive behind the man's impassive face. Was this a trick? A more sophisticated kind of trap? Why? The question was barely audible. Kale didn't answer immediately. He looked at Elian, at the fear and confusion in his honey-colored eyes. Why? He had been asking himself the same question for hours. Because of the scent, because of a flicker of a memory, because the sight of Elian's terror had sparked a protective instinct he hadn't known he possessed. None of those were acceptable answers. None of them were logical. "Your designation is a threat to Citadel stability," Kale stated, falling back on the familiar catechism of his training. "But your collapse was a medical issue. I treated it as such." It was a weak, transparent lie. They both knew it. "What happens now?" Elian asked, his voice trembling. "You're a liability," Kyle said, his tone clinical. "You cannot return to the archives. You're sent. It will not go unnoticed again. The suppressants you were using have failed permanently." The finality of the words was like a prison sentence. Elian's whole life, the quiet, invisible existence he had so carefully built, was gone. He felt a wave of despair so profound it threatened to drown him. He had nothing left. No home, no job, no future. Just this sterile white room and the terrifying Alpha who held his life in his hands. A strange, reckless courage born of desperation rose in him. If he was going to be reintegrated, if they were going to erase him, then someone would know who he had been. He looked directly at the Alpha, meeting his cold grey gaze. "My name is Elian," he said, his voice gaining a small measure of strength. "I'm from the outer sectors. I came here when I was a boy. I didn't have anything. The Citadel offered food, shelter, a purpose. The suppressants, they offered a life, a chance to be normal, to not be seen as volatile, a problem to be managed." He spoke of his childhood in the forgotten districts beyond the Citadel's gleaming walls, a place where the air wasn't scrubbed clean, where you could smell the rain before it fell, and the metallic tang of decay from the scrap heaps. He spoke of the dream of the Citadel, a paradise of order and safety, and the crushing reality of having to cut away a piece of himself to be allowed inside. He didn't know why he was telling him this. It was a confession, a litany of crimes against the state. But he couldn't stop. He needed, just once, to be seen for who he truly was. Not the grey beta archivist, but the Omega boy who dreamed of a world with real seasons. "I just wanted to belong somewhere," he finished, his voice breaking. He looked down at his hands, ashamed of his own vulnerability. He expected scorn, or perhaps the cold, clinical pity of a doctor diagnosing a terminal illness. He did not expect the alpha to move closer. Kyle listened, his face an unreadable mask. Outer sectors, suppressants, a life built on a lie. It was a standard fugitive narrative. And yet, it wasn't. The boy, Elian, spoke with a quiet, desperate sincerity that resonated past Kale's defenses. He spoke of scent and seasons with a longing that Kyle, who lived in a world devoid of both, found himself inexplicably understanding. He was a creature of instinct and nature, trapped in a cage of steel and logic. And Kyle, the zookeeper, had just lied to his superiors to keep him here. When Elian fell silent, his shoulders slumped in defeat, Kyle saw the small wooden charm again, resting against the grey fabric of the tunic. Without thinking, he reached out, his gloved fingers brushing against the worn wood. Elian flinched at the contact, but didn't pull away. "This," Kale said, his voice softer than he intended. "Where did you get it?" Elian looked at the charm, his expression softening with a deep, ancient sadness. "It's all I have left of my parents," he whispered. "My mother gave it to me. She said it was a swift. She said they could fly through any storm. She told me to keep it, to always remember. Before they were taken. Before he was left alone. Before he had to flee to the citadel and start erasing himself. The story was simple, tragic, and it should not have affected Kale. But the shape of the bird, the story of the storm, it was pulling at that thread of memory again, harder this time. He let go of the charm as if it were burning hot. He looked at Elian, truly looked at him, and saw not just a frightened Omega, but a survivor. A boy who had fought his entire life for a place in a world that had no place for him. And in that moment, Kale's carefully constructed world, his belief in the system, in the necessity of order, began to fracture. The crack was small, hairline, but it was there, and it started with the impossible scent of rain and a small wooden bird. The archivist's story echoed in the sterile silence of Kyle's quarters. "It's all I have left of my parents." The words and the image of the small wooden swift had lodged themselves in Kale's mind like a shard of glass. He sat before his personal data terminal, the cool blue light painting his face in stark relief. For the past hour, he had been running simulations, reviewing patrol schedules, doing anything to distract himself from the sleeping Omega in the secure medical bay and the monumental act of treason he had committed. It was useless. The scent of rain and petals still clung to his uniform, a phantom reminder of his transgression. The memory the charm had triggered was no longer a flicker. It was a persistent itch at the back of his consciousness, a locked door he suddenly felt compelled to open. Duty and logic screamed at him to leave it alone, to erase the Omega from his life and his mind, to double down on his loyalty to the Directorate. But the part of him that had caught Elian when he fell, the part that had lied on an official report, that part was now in control. It demanded answers. With a grim sense of finality, he opened a secure channel to the Directorate's central archives, not the public-facing repository. Elian worked in, but the deep vaults, the black box servers where the Citadel kept its secrets. His command-level clearance was a master key, but some files were sealed even from him. He began with a simple search. Outer Sectors Relocation Initiative. the official term for the period 2 decades ago when the Citadel had expanded its borders, absorbing and civilizing the outlying settlements. The public files were sanitized, full of glowing reports about improved living standards and societal integration. It was the history he had been taught. It was a lie. He sliced deeper, using command overrides to access restricted files from the Purity Directorate's early history. The terminology shifted. Relocation became pacification. Integration became purification. And then he found the term that made the blood run cold in his veins: Omegaverse. It wasn't an official program. It was a ghost, a series of heavily redacted operational directives and casualty reports from 20 years ago. The official narrative was that the Citadel had benevolently brought unstable Omega populations into the safety of the suppressant program. The truth, buried under layers of encryption, was far more brutal. They hadn't been integrated. They had been eliminated. Families were separated, alphas and betas absorbed into the system, while the omegas. The reports were vague, filled with euphemisms like processed, neutralized, or reassigned to special projects. Kyle felt a cold knot of dread tighten in his stomach. The Citadel wasn't built on order. It was built on a genocide. His fingers flew across the holographic interface, his movements sharp and precise. He cross-referenced dates, sector designations, operational call signs. He was looking for something, though he wasn't sure what. A name, a face, a reason for the ache in his chest. On a hunch, he initiated a visual search, inputting the design of the swift charm. The system churned for a moment, sifting through trillions of data points. Then a single file was returned. It was sealed with the highest level of security, flagged with a biosignature lock, Kyle's own biosignature. He stared at the screen, his mind struggling to comprehend. It was a personal file, a sealed family record. His family record. He pressed his palm against the scanner. The lock disengaged with a soft chime. The file opened. It was a medical report for a child. Name, Lyran. Designation, Omega. Date of birth, 22 years ago. Status, deceased. Cause of death, congenital respiratory failure. The report was co-signed by his father, a high-ranking directorate official at the time, and a man named Director Valerius, his mentor. Beneath the medical report was a single grainy image, a family portrait, his father stern and proud in his uniform, his mother, her face a mask of strained sorrow, a young boy of 5 with pale grey eyes and a severe haircut, looking uncomfortable in a formal tunic. Himself. And in his mother's arms, a small toddler, no more than 2 years old, with wide, honey-coloured eyes and a tuft of dark hair. The toddler was holding a small, crudely carved wooden bird. The locked door in his mind didn't just open. It was blown off its hinges. The memory, the real memory, came rushing back in a torrent of sensory detail. Rain. Not the recycled, sterile water of the Citadel's weather systems, but a real, cold, pounding rain against the window of their high-sector apartment. The scent of his mother's tears, salty and sharp. The smell of his father's anger, a bitter metallic alpha scent that made the air feel thin. Shouting, his mother pleading, his father, his voice cold and absolute. It is for the good of the Citadel. It is for the good of our family. He is a liability. He remembered the other men in black uniforms, their faces impassive. He remembered his little brother, Lyran, crying in his mother's arms, his small hands clutching the wooden swift. He remembered his mother pressing the charm into Lyran's hand and whispering, Fly through the storm, my love, always. He remembered them taking his brother away. He remembered his father telling him the next day that Lyran had been very sick and that he had gone away to a better place. He had died. He was 5 years old, and he had believed it. He had buried the memory, the grief, the confusion under layers of conditioning and training. He had become the perfect son, the perfect enforcer, the perfect instrument of the system that had stolen his brother, Lyran, Elian. The names were different, but the face, the eyes, the age, it was all the same. The boy in the secure medical bay, the Omega who smelled of rain and flowers, was not just a fugitive. He was not just an anomaly. He was Lyran. He was his brother. The sterile air of the room felt thick, suffocating. Kyle stumbled back from the terminal, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His entire life, his entire identity, was a lie constructed to hide a monstrous truth. He was not a guardian of order. He was the son of a monster, the disciple of a butcher, and the jailer of his own long-lost brother. The realization was a physical blow, shattering the icy control he had cultivated his entire life, leaving him raw, exposed, and shaking with a fury so profound it threatened to tear him apart from the inside out. The walk back to the secure bay was the longest of Kyle's life. Every step was a conscious effort, his legs feeling like lead. The pristine white corridors of his barracks seemed to mock him, their clean lines a stark contrast to the filth he had uncovered. He was moving through the architecture of a lie. His own life was a lie. He carried a small data slate, the unlocked file a leaden weight in his hand. How could he tell him? How could he look into the eyes of the brother he had failed to protect, the brother he had been raised to hunt, and explain the truth of what had been stolen from them? He reached the door, its seamless surface impassive. He took a deep breath, the sterile air doing nothing to calm the storm inside him, and keyed it open. Elian was awake, sitting on the edge of the bed, his posture tense. He looked up as Kyle entered, fear and defiance warring in his honey-colored eyes. He had a fragile strength, this boy, this brother. He had survived 20 years alone, hiding his very nature, and had still retained a core of self that Kyle, with all his power and privilege, had never been allowed to possess. The thought was humbling, and it fueled the fire of his rage against the system he had served. Kyle said nothing. He walked to the foot of the bed and held out the data slate. Elian looked at it, then up at Kyle, his expression wary. "What is it?" "The truth," Kyle said, his voice rough. Elian took the slate, his fingers brushing against Kyle's. The brief contact was electric, a jolt of shared history neither of them yet understood. He looked down at the screen. The image of the family resolved in the low light. He saw the stern alpha, the sad woman, the severe-looking little boy. And then he saw the toddler in the woman's arms. He saw his own eyes, his own face, staring back at him from across 2 decades. His gaze flickered to the wooden bird clutched in the toddler's hand, then down to the identical charm that rested against his own chest. His breath hitched. A single, crystalline memory pierced the fog of his early childhood. A woman's face, soft and sad, her scent like warm milk and lavender, humming a lullaby about a bird that could outfly the rain. My mother. He looked from the toddler in the picture to the 5-year-old boy standing beside him. The same pale, intense grey eyes, the same severe set of his jaw. He looked up at the enforcer standing before him. The boy had grown into the man. The lines were harsher, the eyes colder. But it was him. No, Elian whispered, shaking his head. It was impossible, a cruel trick. It can't be. Our father was a directorate overseer, Cale said, his voice flat, stripped of all emotion. Our mother. She tried to stop him. When they initiated the purge, our father saw your designation as a stain on his record, a threat to his career. He signed the order himself. He recounted the memory, the rain, the shouting, the men in black. He spoke the name he had just rediscovered. Your name was Lyran. The name resonated in the deepest part of Elian's soul. Lyran. It felt more real, more true than the name he had adopted to hide himself. It was the name his mother had whispered to him. The revelation was not a gentle dawning. It was a cataclysm. It tore through Elian's understanding of his own life, uprooting everything. His desperate search for a place to belong had led him here, to this sterile room, to a brother who was an agent of the very system that had ripped their family apart. The loneliness he had carried his whole life was not the simple ache of an orphan. It was the specific, targeted wound of a child who had been discarded. He looked at Cale, at the enforcer, at his brother, and saw the same loss reflected in his cold, grey eyes. They were two halves of a broken whole, separated by a lie. The anger and fear that had been his constant companions were suddenly dwarfed by a wave of profound, soul-crushing grief. He wasn't just an Omega. He was a son and a brother. He hadn't just been hiding. He had been stolen. The data slate slipped from his fingers, clattering to the floor. The sound echoed the fall of the injector in the archive, another life-shattering moment. He wrapped his arms around himself, a shudder racking his body. Cale took a hesitant step forward, his hand half raised as if to offer comfort, a gesture he didn't seem to know how to complete. The bond between them, the strange pull that had begun with a scent, was now redefined. It was not just Alpha and Omega. It was blood. It was tragedy. The moment of shattered silence was broken by the soft chime of the door's access panel. Both of them froze, their heads snapping toward the entrance, a request for entry. Cale's blood ran cold. No one knew about this bay. No one should be here. His comms unit remained silent. Whoever it was, they had command-level override. The door hissed open. A man stood in the doorway, flanked by two heavily armed enforcers from the Directorate's elite Crimson Guard. He was older, with silver hair swept back from a high forehead and a face that was calm and patrician. He wore the simple, immaculate white uniform of a Citadel director. His eyes, a placid, intelligent blue, moved from Cale to Elian, his expression one of mild disappointment, like a teacher discovering a favorite student cheating on an exam. "Commander Cale," Director Valerius said, his voice smooth and untroubled. "I must admit, I'm surprised. Filing a false report? Harboring an unregistered Omega? It's so unlike you." Valerius stepped into the room, his presence radiating a quiet, absolute authority that made Cale's command presence feel like a child's imitation. He had been monitoring him. He had seen the unauthorized searches into the sealed archives. He had let Cale discover the truth, waiting for him to make his move. It had all been a test Cale had just spectacularly failed. "He is my brother," Cale said, the words feeling like stones in his mouth. He moved instinctively, placing himself partially between Valerius and Elian. Valerius smiled, a thin, bloodless expression. "Yes, a most unfortunate familial complication. Your father was a practical man. He understood the need for difficult sacrifices to ensure societal stability, a lesson I had hoped he passed on to you. The director's calm, reasonable tone was more terrifying than any threat. He was not a villain monologuing, he was a scientist explaining the unfortunate necessity of culling a diseased animal from the herd. He was the architect of the purge, the man who had co-signed his brother's death warrant. "It's time to correct your father's one sentimentality, Kale," Valerius continued, his gaze shifting to Elian with cold, clinical assessment. He couldn't bring himself to terminate the boy. He had him shipped to the outer sectors, wiped and abandoned. A loose end, one that has now, inconveniently, found its way back. The Omega will be taken for reintegration. His condition will be corrected. Reintegration, a lobotomy. They would scoop out his mind, his memories, his very self, leaving behind a placid, empty shell. Kyle felt the alpha in him, the one that had been awakened by Elian's scent, rise with a violence that eclipsed all reason. It was no longer a caged beast. It was a storm, and it was about to break. "No," Kale said. The word was not a plea. It was a declaration of war. It hung in the air, absolute and final. Valerius's placid smile didn't falter. He simply sighed, a parent disappointed by a stubborn child. "Loyalty is a commendable trait, Kale, but it must be properly placed. Your loyalty is to the Citadel, to order, to me. This creature," he gestured dismissively toward Elian, "is a relic of a chaotic past. He is a biological error. You are an enforcer. You excise errors." "He is my blood," Kyle growled, the sound low and feral. He could feel Elian trembling behind him, his fear a sharp, poignant note in the air. But beneath it, there was a new scent, the metallic tang of defiance. They were afraid, but they were not broken. "Sentiment," Valerius countered, his voice still maddeningly calm. "The very thing we have worked for generations to filter from the human condition. It is the root of all instability." He gave a subtle nod to the Crimson Guard. Their pulse rifles whined as they powered up, the crimson glow of their targeting lasers painting dots on Kyle's chest. "You have a choice, Commander. A final opportunity to demonstrate the logic and discipline I have spent years cultivating in you. Step aside. Hand over the Omega. Your lapse in judgment will be forgiven. You will resume your post, and we will never speak of this again. Or you can be declared a traitor, an alpha compromised by pheromonal influence, and be reintegrated alongside him." The choice was an illusion. There was no choice. Stepping aside meant sacrificing his brother, his soul, to the very monster who had destroyed their family. It meant returning to a life that was now revealed to be a hollow cage. His years of service, his belief in the system, his identity as an enforcer, it all turned to ash in his mouth. He had been a tool, nothing more, a weapon wielded by men like Valerius. He looked at Elian, at his brother. He saw the terror in his eyes, but also the flicker of fight. He saw the boy who had survived 2 decades alone. He saw the swift that could fly through any storm. He would not let that storm end here, in this sterile white room. He slowly raised his hands, a universal gesture of surrender. The Crimson Guard relaxed fractionally. Valerius's smile widened. "A wise decision, Kale. I knew you would see reason." But Kale's eyes were not on Valerius. They were locked on the environmental control panel on the wall behind him. His mind, trained for tactical analysis, raced through schematics and probability vectors. The secure bay was on an independent power grid, but it was still tied to the sector's primary life support and lighting systems, a targeted surge routed through his personal comms unit. It was a long shot, a desperate, insane gamble. "I'm sorry, Director," Kyle said, his voice cold and even. "My education appears to have been incomplete." With a speed that defied belief, his hand shot to his wrist-mounted comms unit. He didn't issue a voice command. He tapped a sequence of override codes, a backdoor he had built into the system years ago for just such an impossible contingency. "Execute Protocol 0. The lights in the room flickered once, twice, and then died, plunging the bay into absolute disorienting darkness. Simultaneously, the piercing shriek of a life support failure alarm blared through the corridor, followed by the clang of emergency blast doors sealing off the sector. Chaos erupted. The Crimson Guard, their night vision optics momentarily whited out by the sudden power surge, fired blindly. A bolt of plasma sizzled through the space where Kyle had been standing a second before, but Kyle was already moving. In the pitch black, he was the predator. He grabbed Elian's arm, his grip like steel. "Stay with me," he yelled over the alarm. He shoved his brother toward the wall, away from the line of fire. He moved on pure instinct, his senses, no longer dulled by the Citadel's sterile environment, screaming with input. He could smell the ozone tang of the rifle discharges, the acrid scent of the guard's fear, and beneath it all, the sharp, terrified fragrance of his brother. He was a shield. He was a weapon. He was no longer an enforcer. He was a brother, protecting his own. The escape had begun. The darkness was absolute, a thick, suffocating blanket. The only light was the brief, strobing flash of plasma bolts tearing through the space, each one a snapshot of chaos. The only sound was the deafening shriek of the alarm and the harsh crackle of discharged energy. For a moment, Elian was paralyzed by sheer terror. This was the system he had feared his entire life, and it was now trying to kill him with brutal efficiency. Then, a hand closed around his wrist, a grip of unyielding strength that anchored him in the swirling vortex of panic. Kale, his brother. "This way." Kale's voice was a low command, cutting through the din. He pulled Elian forward, his body a solid shield between him and the blind firing of the guards. Elian stumbled, his senses completely overwhelmed. He was used to the quiet, ordered world of the archives. This was a maelstrom, but then something shifted inside him. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach, but something else was rising to meet it. For the first time since childhood, his body was not blunted by suppressants. His Omega senses, for so long a source of shame and terror, were now screamingly awake. The darkness was not empty. It was full of information. He could smell the sharp, metallic fear scent of the two guards to their left, the ozone crackle of a charging power pack to their right. He could feel the subtle shift in air pressure as Kale moved, anticipating the next volley of fire. "Wait," Elian gasped, pulling back on Kale's arm. "To the right. There's a maintenance conduit. I feel a draft." Kale paused for a fraction of a second, his tactical mind likely screaming that the primary exit was their only logical route. But he trusted him. "Lead," he commanded. Elian, guided by a sense he was only just beginning to understand, pulled them toward the wall. His hands skimmed the smooth surface until he felt the almost invisible seam of a panel. He fumbled for a latch, his fingers finding a recessed grip. He pulled, and a section of the wall swung inward, revealing a dark, narrow space, humming with the vibration of unseen machinery. They scrambled inside just as another plasma bolt struck the wall where they had been standing, filling the medical bay with the stench of molten metal. Kale slammed the panel shut behind them, plunging them into a new, more confined darkness. The alarms were muffled now, the sounds of shouting and gunfire distant. The only sounds were their own ragged breaths and the deep, rhythmic thrum of the Citadel's guts. They were in the service tunnels, the arteries and veins of the machine. It was a maze of pipes, cables, and narrow catwalks, slick with condensation and smelling of ozone and ionized dust. Kale activated a low-lumen light on his gauntlet, casting a small pool of pale white light before them. His face was grim, his grey eyes scanning the darkness with lethal focus. He was no longer the cold, detached commander. He was a warrior. "We need to get to the lower levels," Kyle said, his voice tight. "The transport hub for the outer sectors. It's our only way out." They moved through the labyrinthine tunnels, a two-man insurgency against a city-sized machine. Kale took the lead, his weapon drawn, his movements economical and deadly. He was the embodiment of the system's own training, now turned against it. He dispatched the few patrol drones they encountered with ruthless, silent efficiency. But Elian was not just a liability to be protected. His awakened senses were their map and their early warning system. He could hear the faint hum of an approaching patrol long before it appeared. He could smell the trace pheromones of a guard post around the next bend. He could feel the vibrations in the floor that signaled the passage of a heavy cargo transport overhead, a perfect cover for their own noise. They became a unit, a seamless fusion of Kyle's tactical prowess and Elian's raw, intuitive senses. They moved in silence, communicating through touch and gesture, a hand on the arm to signal stop, a pressure on the back to signal go. In the oppressive darkness of the Citadel's underbelly, they were relearning a language older than words. At one point, they were pinned down, trapped in a junction, as the sound of heavy boots echoed from both ends of the corridor. There was nowhere to run. Kyle flattened them both into a small alcove, shielding Elian with his body, his pulse rifle raised. This was it. They were caught. Then Elian saw it, a vertical shaft above them, covered by a simple metal grate. "Up," he whispered, pointing. Kyle looked up, assessed the distance, and nodded. He holstered his rifle, braced himself, and linked his hands. "Climb." Elian didn't hesitate. He stepped into Kyle's hands and was launched upward. He grabbed the grate, his fingers straining. It was heavy, rusted in place. He pulled, his muscles screaming, and with a groan of tortured metal, it came loose. He hauled himself up into the shaft, just as a searchlight beam sliced through the darkness below. Kyle followed a moment later, pulling himself up with the explosive power of a coiled spring. He pulled the grate back into place. They were safe for now. They huddled together in the narrow shaft, the sounds of the patrol passing directly beneath them. Kale's breathing was controlled, but Elian could feel the tension thrumming through him. He looked at his brother, his face cast in shadow, and saw not the terrifying enforcer from the archive, but the scared 5-year-old boy from the photograph. "I'm sorry," Kale said, the words a raw whisper in the dark. "For all of it, for not knowing, for not being there." "You're here now," Elian replied, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. And in that moment, the last of the fear between them dissolved, replaced by a fierce, desperate love. They continued their descent, moving from service tunnels to forgotten maintenance shafts, getting closer and closer to the Citadel's outer skin. They finally emerged into a cavernous, dimly lit space. The air here was different. It was heavy with the smell of fuel, grease, and the faint, tantalizing scent of something organic, something from outside. The cargo bay. A massive blast door, sealed and guarded, was the only thing that separated them from the transport hub. "This is as far as we go," Kyle said, his eyes on the two guards stationed by the door. "I'll create a diversion. When the door opens, you run. Don't look back." "No," Elian said, his voice firm. "We do this together." Before Kale could argue, Elian focused, casting his senses out, searching. The guards were betas, their senses dull. But the system had other eyes. He felt the low-level hum of the security network, a web of energy around them. But it had a flaw. A massive power conduit ran directly beneath the guard station, creating a blind spot in the sensor grid. "There," he said, pointing. "Under the floor plates. We can get to the door without being seen." It was Kale's turn to trust. They moved low and fast, using the shadows of massive cargo containers for cover, their path guided by Elian's senses. They reached the blast door undetected. Kale pulled a small device from his belt and pressed it against the control panel. A series of codes scrolled across its tiny screen. "This will take a minute," he whispered. As they waited, the seconds stretching into an eternity, Elian looked back the way they had come, back into the dark maze of the Citadel. It had been his prison, his sanctuary, the only home he had ever known. He was leaving it all behind. He felt a hand on his shoulder and looked up. Kyle was watching him, his expression unreadable in the dim light. The lock on the door gave a loud, metallic clank. The two guards turned, their rifles raising. Kyle didn't hesitate. He shoved Elian through the now opening crack in the door. "Go." This moment was a perfect, terrible mirror of their first meeting. Then Kyle had pulled him into confinement. Now he was pushing him toward freedom. Elian stumbled through the doorway and into the transport hub, the sounds of a firefight erupting behind him. He didn't look back. He ran. The transport hub was a chaotic symphony of noise and motion. The shriek of magnetic rail shuttles, the roar of cargo lifters, the cacophony of automated announcements echoing through the cavernous space. The air was thick with the smells Elian had only dreamed of, the rich, loamy scent of soil from hydroponics shipments, the sharp brine of water being piped to the upper sectors, the exhaust fumes of machinery that burned chemical fuel. It was overwhelming, a sensory deluge that made his head spin. He kept running, weaving through droids and workers, his eyes searching for an outbound shuttle, one destined for the outer sectors. He heard the heavy clang of the blast door slamming shut behind him, followed by the chilling sound of lockdown alarms. The entire hub began to flash with red emergency lights. They knew he was here. He was trapped. He ducked behind a stack of crates, his breath coming in ragged sobs. Kyle was back there, fighting alone. He had pushed him to freedom, but it was just a larger cage. A wave of despair washed over him. He was a fugitive, an Omega, alone and unsuppressed. He would be hunted. He would be caught. He had traded one cell for another. Then he heard it. Kyle's voice, sharp and clear over the hub's comms system, overriding the automated alarms. "All security to sub-level 4. Fugitive has breached the water reclamation conduits. Seal the sector." It was a lie, a diversion. Kale was drawing the hunt away from the hub, away from him, buying him time. The realization struck Elian with the force of a physical blow. Kale was sacrificing himself for him. A new strength, born of love and fury, surged through him. He would not let that sacrifice be in vain. He was not the frightened archivist anymore. He was Lyran. He was the swift that flew through the storm. He scanned the departure boards, his eyes finally locking on a destination. Perimeter Gate 7. Unscheduled cargo hauler. Final call. It was a rust bucket freighter, probably hauling waste material to the outer reclamation zones. It was perfect. He ran, pushing his body harder than he ever had before. The loading ramp of the freighter was already beginning to rise. He could see the guards converging on the docking bay, their attention drawn by the lockdown. He wasn't going to make it. "Wait!" he screamed, his voice raw. But no one heard him over the alarms. Just as the ramp was about to seal, a figure dropped from the gantries above, landing with a heavy thud on the rising metal. Kyle. His black uniform was torn and scorched, a fresh cut bleeding freely above his eye. But he was alive. He turned and extended a hand to Elian. "I told you to run," he said, his voice strained. "You told me to stay with you," Elian shot back, grabbing his hand. Kale hauled him onto the ramp just as it sealed shut, plunging them into the dim, rumbling darkness of the cargo hold. They had made it. They collapsed against the cold wall of a container, their chests heaving, the adrenaline slowly beginning to fade, leaving behind a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. The freighter shuddered as it disengaged from its moorings and began to move. They were leaving the citadel. They were outside. The freighter's cargo bay doors opened with a groaning hydraulic hiss, revealing not the recycled light of the citadel, but a vast, bruised purple sky, bleeding into orange at the horizon, a sky full of real, fiery stars. The air that rushed in was cold and wet, carrying a scent so complex and overwhelming that Elian felt his knees go weak. It was the smell of damp earth, of decaying leaves, of wild, growing things. It was the smell of the world. Kale helped him to the edge of the ramp. They stood there, two escapees, on the edge of a new reality. Below them was not the gleaming, sterile geometry of the citadel, but a rugged landscape of dark, rain-slicked rock and twisted, skeletal trees. The wind, a real and untamed wind, whipped at their clothes, chilling them to the bone. It was terrifying. It was beautiful. Kale looked out at the horizon, his face unreadable. He had spent his entire life inside the machine, enforcing its rules, believing its lies. Now, he was an outcast, a traitor, standing under an open sky for the first time. Elian reached out and took his brother's hand. Kyle's fingers, no longer covered by his enforcer gloves, were calloused and warm. He squeezed back, his grip firm and grounding. They didn't speak. There were no words for the immensity of what they had lost and what they had just found. The grief for their stolen family, for their lost years, was a vast, silent ocean between them. But in their clasped hands, there was a bridge, a promise. They were no longer an enforcer and a fugitive. They were not just an alpha and an omega. They were Kyle and Lyran. They were brothers, bound by blood and by the fire of their escape. The future was a terrifying unknown, a wilderness stretching out before them. They would be hunted by the citadel. They would have to fight for their survival every single day. But as they stood there, watching the first true dawn of their lives paint the horizon, they were not afraid. They were wounded. They were exhausted, and they were irrevocably broken from the world that had made them. But they were free. And for the first time, the future, in all its wild and dangerous uncertainty, was theirs. The storm was not over. It was just beginning. But for the first time, they would face it together.